Hey students, this video is going to look into what it is we know about the evolution of social interactions, and we're going to take some of the knowledge we have about processes such as selection, natural selection, to explain some of the different behaviors we see amongst a handful of sort of really interesting taxonomic groups. And when we're talking about social interactions, we're often talking about interactions that have different costs and benefits to the parties involved. And when we talk about the parties involved, we're talking about actors and recipients. So actors are individuals who do something, and that thing that they do has an effect upon the recipients. And we can kind of look at these types of interactions as having four different possible outcomes, depending on whether the effects of the actors are positive or negative for the actor, or positive or negative upon the recipient. And if the effect of the actor is positive upon the actor, and the effect on to the recipient is also positive, we would call that relationship a mutualism. If instead the effect to the actor is negative, and the effect on the recipient is still positive, we would call that relationship altruistic. If the effect on the actor is positive and the effect upon the recipient is negative, we would call that relationship selfish, particularly uh, a selfish act on the part of the actor. And even stranger is that if the effect on the actor is negative and the effect on the recipient is also negative, we would call that relationship spiteful. And so, what we kind of see from these different kinds of relationships is that social interactions really can affect the fitnesses of different individuals involved in both positive and negative ways. And when different fitness interests are sort of opposed to one another, we say that this leads to conflict. And when instead one individual's actions benefit another individual, we would then say instead that that situation entails that there's some amount of cooperation. And so a couple real examples of this are shown in these images here. We could think about organisms such as Florida scrub jays engaged in fighting, which is probably going to have either a positive effect on one individual and a negative effect on the other, possibly even a negative effect on both. And so this would be an example of conflict. In contrast, we can think about things like honeybees, which are engaged in tremendous amounts of cooperation. And we could think of that cooperation as being perhaps either mutualistic or maybe even really being more altruistic. And when we talk about altruism, what is this thing called altruism? It turns out to be one of the stranger aspects of this sort of these different kinds of relationships, or the stranger kind of these types of relationships that we see. Why would one individual sort of sacrifice their own fitness in order to help increase the fitness of another? And so this is a really interesting situation that plays out in nature. And we'll attempt to explain why this happens or look at how it happens. For example, we can look at the dual courtship displays of lance-tailed manakins. So in these displays, there will typically be an alpha male and a beta male. And the alpha male and the beta male take turns trying to court this particular female here. And she's impressed by the display of both the male and the female, but ultimately, I'm sorry, both the alpha male and the beta male, but ultimately she will only end up mating with the alpha male most of the time, which is sort of what's being illustrated on this graph here on the right, where we can see the status of the two different types of males, alpha and beta, and basically their fitness on the y-axis, how many chicks they were able to sire. And alpha males, unsurprisingly, tend to sire most of the chicks. Now, sometimes beta males will go on to become alpha males in future matings, but this is just a typical situation where this beta male is kind of sacrificing its own fitness for the increase of fitness in order to benefit the fitness of the alpha male. Why might this happen? Likewise, we can talk about flocks of birds or even schools of fishes, things like these starlings here who are defending an attack by this raptor, which is called a harrier in this case. Why is it that these birds might come together in this sort of social group, this very large social group, for the sort of greater good of the entire of the entire group? This is kind of an interesting question that evolutionary biologists have attempted to answer. And as it turns out, that one of the best explanations we have for this is that there's really this other kind of fitness that exists that we call inclusive fitness. And inclusive fitness really accounts for the full benefit individuals receive from the inheritance of shared genes. And so we can think of this very simple equation here that describes inclusive fitness, which we also sometimes might call total fitness, as the sum of an individual's direct fitness, so the fitness they gain from carrying alleles associated with high levels of reproductive success, plus this thing called indirect fitness. And this is a new kind of fitness we haven't really looked at, and it turns out to be the fitness an individual gains by their relatives passing on shared alleles to the next generation. And so even if an individual doesn't have a lot of direct fitness, if their next of kin, so to speak, do, they're still gaining some fitness because their close relatives almost certainly share some of the same genetic information. And if those close relatives are passing those genes on to the next generation, individuals who might not be reproducing as much are still gaining some fitness. And we can think about this more quantitatively in the context of something we call relatedness. And so the magnitude of inclusive fitness that an organism might be able to gain if their nearest relatives are involved in reproduction really has to do with how closely related they are to one another, because that's directly something tied to the amount of genetic information that they share. A good example, or a good example for looking at this might be thinking about the ways that different cousins might be related, and looking at this specifically in the context of how many of the grandparents they have do they share. For example, they could only share one grandparent, or they could share both grandparents. And this relationship is directly influencing their relatedness. And don't get lost in the sort of math going on here too much. The idea is that the number of meiotic events that are happening between the point at which this grandmother first reproduces and gives rise to these cousins is going to be an important factor in dictating how related these two cousins, A and B, are. So in this particular example, two cousins share a single grandparent. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 meiotic events that led to the production of these grandchildren. And we know that in each of these meiotic events, about 50% of the genetic information is being passed from parent to offspring because of the way that sexual reproduction works, because a mother is passing on 50% of her genes and a father is passing on 50% of his genes in each of these situations. And so we would take that number of 50% and raise it to the power of 4, which is the number of meiotic events. And that gives us an estimate of this thing called the coefficient of relatedness between these two cousins, A and B, which is about 0.0625. Or to put it in plainer terms, these two cousins share about 6.3% of their genetic information by virtue of sharing one grandparent, one grandmother in this case. Instead, if two particular cousins shared two grandparents, a grandfather and a grandmother, what we see are more meiotic events happening now, leading to the formation of these cousins. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 meiotic events coming from the shared grandfather, and 1, 2, 3, 4 meiotic events coming from the shared grandmother. And now we have to account for that fact that there are these two independent ways that genes are getting passed down, either from a grandmother or from a grandfather. And so, again, assuming that 50% of the genetic information of each of these grandparents is finding its way to the next generation, and then from those offspring down to yet the next generation, we would say, okay, well, 50% raised to the power of 1, 2, 3, 4, plus 50% raised to the power of 1, 2, 3, 4 gives us a coefficient of relatedness amongst these, or between these two cousins, A and B, that is instead now 0.125. Or again, to put it into plainer terms, these two cousins are share about 12.5% of their genetic information. And so again, don't lose sight of the forest for the trees. Don't get lost in the math. The point is to understand we can quantify um, an estimate of how related different individuals are based on the probability of them sharing genes. And this starts to point towards how much inclusive fitness individuals can gain, whether or not they're actually reproducing, um, relative to how related they are to their nearest kin or some of their relatives that are reproducing. And so again, this thing we call inclusive fitness depends upon an individual's direct fitness, but this indirect fitness is what they're gaining uh, according to how many offspring one of their particular relatives or a handful of different relatives might be producing as well. And so the idea here really is to put indirect fitness into the context of relatedness. Uh, Individuals who have, let's say, if there's two siblings, they're going to be 50% related to one another. If one sibling reproduces and the other does not, that sibling who doesn't reproduce is going to gain more fitness from that sibling that does reproduce when compared to if a first cousin or a second cousin reproduces instead. And that also depends upon, again, whether or not these cousins share, particularly in the case of first cousins, whether or not they share grandparents or not. And so more closely related individuals are going to have a higher chance of providing each other with indirect fitness. And this kind of helps explain altruism in certain ways. And this actually has been proposed in this sort of simple mathematical framework that we call Hamilton's rule. And Hamilton's rule basically weighs the costs and benefits of altruistic behavior, this sort of self sacrificing behavior. And the postulation here is that an allele causing altruistic behavior to happen will spread under some pretty basic conditions. We can look at the coefficient of relatedness, which we call little r, and then we can look at big B and big C, where big B is the fitness benefit to the receiver, and big C is the fitness benefit to the actor. And big B really does stand for benefit, and big C really does stand for cost. And so if this particular relationship is true, where the product of relatedness and benefit is greater than the cost of this act, then it will be favored basically under natural selection. And so, in other words, altruism is really something that's going to be favored with increasing levels of relatedness, increasing benefit compared to cost. And the likelihood of this being successful really depends upon how often individuals interact with each other, because as individuals interact with each other more often, they start to get to know each other better, and that increases the probability that there might be an altruistic act that takes a certain cost that then yields a certain benefit. And what is a situation that could allow individuals to interact with each other more often? If they're in the same family with one another. But that's not always the case, but that's certainly a situation where individuals are probably going to be interacting with one another more often than with other folks, is when they share the same family. And this leads to this concept of something we call kin selection, which is sort of just a very special kind of natural selection where actions that individuals who are closely related are performing that might benefit some of their family members are going to be favored under natural selection. We might call this behavior altruism. And kin selection really does increase the frequency of traits that are associated with this thing called inclusive fitness. And we can think of, for example, a family of wolves coordinating their efforts to attack a single bison for whatever reason, whether or not they're going to be able to get a meal out of this bison, or they're able to protect each other and their offspring from threats from this bison, perhaps. Whatever the case may be in this scenario, it does appear that kin selection is favoring this coordinated behavior amongst these different wolves. And this might be happening because of group protection. There might be other reasons why types of behaviors that are favored via kin selection happen, like signaling, or things that, again, help different family groups improve their ability to get food from the environment. or even certain situations where different family members are assisting each other with grooming one another, which might actually lower the chances of them being infected by parasites, or situations where different family members are helping raise offspring that are not necessarily theirs, again, because they're gaining some indirect fitness, because those offspring, even if they're not their own offspring, still share some of the same genetic information. And all these kinds of behaviors really lead to an overall increase in something we call fecundity, which is basically kind of a fancy word for reproductive success. So, just to reiterate, if there's reproductive success within the family, as a whole, whether or not certain individuals are actually producing offspring, they're still getting a chance for some of their genes to be passed on to the next generation. And that process drives this thing we call kin selection. And we can talk about how this plays out in a couple examples. And a famous example comes from these things called meerkats, you may have heard of, Suricata suricata. And this basically is a situation where we see that kin selection very much favors social organization within closely related groups or closely distributed individuals. And these meerkats in particular form really interesting social orders, which are called mobs. And usually these mobs consist of a few cooperative families. And so within each family, obviously there's going to be higher levels of relatedness, but two, three, or four families might come together and form this cooperative group, wherein they're all sort of benefiting one another for the greater good of the mob. And as it turns out, a lot of the meerkats in these mobs don't actually produce offspring, but their next of kin do. And so there's some level of both indirect fitness and kin selection probably operating in this situation. So, for example, non-breeding subordinates might take turns helping to raise offspring, or they might take turns performing certain roles like warding off predators. And in fact, we can look at how these meerkats have different vocalizations they use that mean different things. For example, they might be able to indicate that there's terrestrial danger and there's a certain call associated with that. They might be able to indicate that there's aerial danger from both of these cases from predators, and they use a different call to signal that. And these two hypothetical individuals in this cartoon almost certainly probably are not going to be involved in reproduction at all. They're just fulfilling a role within this very uh, interesting society that's helping the society sustain itself for the greater good of some individuals ultimately getting to pass on their genes. And we might very much call this behavior social altruism. So there is some level of self-sacrifice going on here amongst these non-reproductive meerkats. But probably we're thinking there is kin selection because there are close relatives of these non-reproductive meerkats that are reproducing, and so their genes actually are getting passed on to subsequent generations, albeit at lower rates. And we know that a lot of these mobs can be very, very competitive with one another. And in fact, they do get involved in wars. And these meerkats will engage in some pretty interesting behavior. They perform these war dances when there is competition between different mobs. And they're probably doing this in order to protect breeding territory, territory where they're gathering other resources from the environment in order to survive. And so there can be some pretty fierce competition amongst these different groups, and they're all sort of fighting for the same purpose, which is to pass their genes on to the next generation. Even if the individuals involved in the war dance don't have offspring, again, their nearest relatives probably do. Some of their nearest relatives probably do, and this gives them a vested interest in protecting the mob as a whole. We can see some similar kinds of behaviors in social predation. And this involves situations where very close relatives coordinate their hunting efforts. So, for example, lion sisters, these are siblings, coordinating their efforts to hunt buffaloes, for example. Or even in our own species, we know that social predation is certainly something that's happened in all kinds of different societies. This is sort of a reconstruction of what indigenous American peoples uh, probably were doing before the advent of European colonization, coordinating their hunting efforts in trying to predate upon bison. And we can also see this rarely in birds, but it does happen in this species called Harris's hawk, where a group of these different raptors will coordinate their hunting efforts for gathering prey. And in all of these situations, we see a very similar unifying theme. First, this sort of increases the likelihood of prey being captured. Greater predator numbers decreases the amount of energy that it takes to try to capture prey, and it also probably maximizes the take. And so this is thought of as being a pretty beneficial thing, not just with the lions, but also in our own species, although it's not something we're doing a whole lot now necessarily in this way, and then also in these birds. And this also seems to be a type of behavior that's beneficial in really resource poor environments, things like deserts or prairie lands, where there aren't a whole lot of other opportunities to get resources or energy from the environment. So if multiple individuals who almost certainly are usually pretty closely related to one another are coordinating their hunting efforts, it really increases the overall survival of that particular group. And that offers something that we call an evolutionary stable strategy. Cooperation really does increase the overall fitness amongst different individuals rather than one individual going out to try to do all that hunting there on their own. One individual might not be successful at hunting at all. Another individual might not be successful at hunting at all. Yet another individual might not be successful at hunting at all, especially if they're trying to take down large game animals. But when those individuals come together and coordinate their hunting efforts, the chances of them successfully gaining that prey as a food resource starts to go up and up and up. And this is also something that's probably closely related to kin selection, closely related individuals coordinating their efforts because basically it's for the greater good of a either family group or a very close-knit social group. But as it turns out, family matters or relationships within families don't necessarily always involve cooperation. Sometimes they, in fact, can involve conflict. And specifically, we can see this happening in the context of parental care. And there is sort of this idea that you could have situations where two parents, the male and female, invest care into their offspring sort of equally. And this might sort of appear to be the most advantageous situation. But then we can start to see situations where biparental care doesn't happen, and instead we have uniparental care. And that's where we go from having sort of cooperation amongst the parents to really seeing more conflict amongst the parents. And why does this happen? Well, although provisioning offspring certainly increases the chance of their survival, it might not necessarily increase the reproductive successes of either of the two parents involved. And for this happens for some different reasons. First of all, parental care is risky. It takes a lot of energy, it takes time. And it's kind of ironic to think that this can compromise a parent's fitness. That is the total number of offspring that they're forming, that they're able to have. And so if parents are investing time and energy into raising their offspring, they're taking time and energy away from possibly going to have more offspring. And so there's kind of a weird quandary in there. And as it turns out, we kind of think of the cost of parental care being greater for males than it is for females, because females sort of inherently are forced to invest a lot of provisioning into their offspring, into raising eggs successfully, whereas males really don't. Males make a whole lot of really cheap sperm. These females are making fewer eggs that are much more energetically expensive. And so if a male is going to invest his time and energy into helping his mate raise her offspring or their offspring, he is sort of negating fitness he could gain by going out and trying to instead find another mate. Uh, and sometimes this happens in some tricky ways. For example, we can look at three-spined sticklebacks, these fish, and this three-spine stickleback is sort of tricking his mate into thinking he's a good mate because he's hanging out, spending a lot of time guarding her eggs. But actually, he's doing this sort of selfishly because if he can attract another female who sees that he's really good at guarding his present mate's eggs, he might have the chance to go on and mate again. And so there's this interesting balance between parental care and parental conflict. And this again leads to something we call an evolutionarily stable strategy, which does seem to maintain fitness amongst interacting pairs. In this case, we're talking about parents. And so in this situation, we kind of see how we have different efforts from either of the two parents, males and females, which is what is being shown on these two different graphs here on the left, where we have the effort of a female compared to a male's optimal effort. And as the female is putting more and more and more effort into rearing offspring, then the effort of the male is starting to decrease with time, and this might actually benefit the male. The opposite situation is seen here, where when the male's effort is increasing and increasing, the female's effort necessarily goes down. And so there's an interesting balance between how much time and energy, effort that either of the two parents are investing in raising their offspring plays upon one another. And this leads to a sort of more complicated situation we see on this graph on the right. But basically, if we again look at female effort here and male effort here, we can see that if the female first starts making some effort, which is represented by X here, effort into raising these offspring, then the effort of the male necessarily sort of goes down or inherently sort of goes down. And then if we see that the effort of the female increases to accommodate for the fact that the male's effort has gone down, then we can see that the male's effort might go down even more. And this causes the female's effort to have to go up more. And then finally, we reach this point where the two efforts basically interact. They reach this intersection, and we call that the evolutionary stable point or the evolutionary stable strategy, where so much effort from the male and so much effort from the female are sort of both going to be required to the point where their offspring will successfully go on to survive and eventually reproduce themselves. And so this is a situation that plays out a lot of the times in terms of what we see with parental care and in other kinds of ecological relationships as well. And so we know that basically either parent's fitness can benefit more if the other parent is investing greater parental care, but they can reach this stable equilibrium, allowing both the parents to equally gain fitness at this particular intersection that we see here. And this is a hypothetical example, of course. But the idea is that it's kind of in both parents' interest to try to invest some level of care into their offspring, regardless of the fact that either of them could gain more fitness if they have the chance to go on and reproduce yet again, be it with the same mates or with different mates. Now, as it turns out, sometimes parents don't actually intend to rear all of their offspring. And we see this in brown boobies, these birds. And these brown boobies, typically females will hatch 2 eggs. But typically, the female really only ever intends to rear one of those 2 eggs. And she might kind of watch how her 2 siblings interact at their very, very young age. And as it turns out, one of those siblings is going to outcompete the other and ultimately either directly kill or just lead this other sibling to the point where they can't get enough resources to survive. And we call this siblicide. And the booby will select which of the 2 siblings seems to have the higher chance of remaining in the nest and getting resources, and the other offspring is basically left to perish. So it's kind of a tragic looking situation, but it certainly happens. So we see these rival siblings sort of competing for resources, and then the parents will choose the more successful of the 2 offspring. But this does happen in nature, in these birds. We also see something similar going on in plants that we call selective embryo abortion. And in selective embryo abortion, mother plants will really allocate resources to the development of seeds that seem to have a higher genetic quality, that seem to have the highest chance of surviving. And they can sense this probably chemically. And so this here is a cartoon showing some developing seeds within a plant's fruit. And basically, the colors here represent differences in the genetic quality of these seeds. And the seeds that have this sort of dark purple color have the highest genetic quality, and the seeds with this sort of lighter purple color have lower genetic quality. And the mother senses this happening and invests resources, provisions seeds of higher genetic quality more so than seeds of lower genetic quality. And we can see an actual picture of how this might play out in these monkey flower seeds here, where some of these seeds were properly fertilized, some of these seeds never got fertilized, and then some of these seeds that were fertilized that probably were of low genetic quality were aborted. And so in this case, plants are producing lots and lots of seeds, potentially able to make a lot of offspring, but they're not equally provisioning resources into all of those. And then we can start asking questions about how inclusive fitness might be affected when offspring themselves are now helping parents raise their siblings. And this is an interesting situation that probably is, in a lot of ways, benefiting the parents because now they can reduce their investment of time and energy in rearing offspring because they have reproductively immature other offspring that are reproductively immature that can help them do the rearing. And we see this actually happening in Florida scrub jays. And this leads to the situation where these older sibs will eventually mature and go on and colonize some new territory and potentially attract a new mate. And the cycle sort of repeats itself over and over and over again. But by virtue of having these reproductively immature offspring that help rear younger offspring, really both the parents and the offspring are all gaining some level of indirect fitness, or they're increasing their overall total fitness, i.e. their inclusive fitness. And so natural selection seems to really be favoring this kind of a process where there are some interesting family bonds going on here, where siblings and parents are cooperating to really lead to a situation where this family is going to get to pass on its genes to subsequent generations. Sometimes a stranger thing happens and one species can fool another species into raising its offspring for it. And we call this brood parasitism. And this is a situation where maybe if a species or an individual, let's just say two different species, as we're going to see in this example, a species can trick the parents of another species into raising their offspring. They don't really have to invest any time or energy into raising those offspring at all, and they can pretty much immediately go on and start trying to find more mates, thus increasing their fitness because they're not spending time provisioning these offspring. They're not spending time trying to build nests. They're not spending time trying to acquire resources. Of course, when we're talking about nests, usually we're talking about birds, and that's actually the example we're going to look at here. And so the common cuckoo is a bird that is shown here, and the common cuckoo is known to be a very vicious brood parasite. And so common cuckoos will watch these reed warblers, and when these reed warblers lay their eggs in their nest, the cuckoo females will sneak into those nests when they have a chance and parasitize it. That is, they're going to lay their own eggs in that same nest. And very often, much of the time, these reed warblers do not recognize that they have foreign eggs in their nest, and they will continue to raise those eggs. And in this image here, we see a reed warbler parent provisioning, helping to raise this cuckoo offspring that it thinks is its own because its eggs were raised in the same nest. But in fact, obviously, these are two very, very different looking species. Occasionally, these parents will realize that there are foreign eggs in their nest and they'll remove these parasitic eggs. Or sometimes they might just abandon the nest altogether. So anyway, it's an interesting situation, again, that selection has favored, where certain very sneaky species have figured out how to trick other species into raising their offspring for them so that they could increase their own fitness, maximize their own fitness. And then can start talking about probably the most extreme kinds of social altruism that we see in closely related groups or family groups, and that is what we call eusociality. And these eusocial colonies generally are composed of many, many non-breeding individuals that really only are ever going to benefit from indirect fitness. And so we see this Rarely in mammals, these things called naked mole rats seem to exhibit this behavior, where again, there'll be only a few reproductive individuals, tons and tons of non-reproductive individuals helping rear the offspring that are produced. We see this much more commonly in insects, things like termites here. We have a queen who is reproducing, and then a bunch of her non-reproductive workers helping her raise these offspring. Some very similar behavior is seen in these ants here, these honeypot ants, where again, we have a society with a reproductive queen and tons of sterile workers who are just helping raise offspring. Likewise in these wasps here. And so this is an interesting situation where you have a large family composed of tons and tons of individuals who don't reproduce, all investing energy into the greater good of the queen's reproductive success. Now, in things like ants and wasps and bees, we see this happening in a very strange way genetically. And these insects are actually all fairly closely related. They're in the same insect order that we call the Hymenoptera. And presumably, this type of system may have arisen from a shared common ancestor. But these hymenopterans are engaged in something we call haplodiploid eusociality. And haploid and diploid refer to the fact that the queen is reproducing offspring that are either going to be diploid, that she produces asexually, or she can undergo sexual reproduction with a male and form diploid offspring. This is a diploid offspring. This is a haploid offspring. And in this mating system, basically, if the queen reproduces asexually, she's going to produce a drone who is effectively male. And if she reproduces sexually, then she's going to reproduce daughters that are going to be diploid. Diploid daughters, haploid sons. And the diploid daughters are going to almost all turn into workers who are going to help her rear her offspring as she's reproducing. The drone, on the other hand, it's really in the best interest of the drone to leave this colony and try to go out and find a new queen in order to mate with her. These drones don't generally perform worker functions within this colony. Now, why does all this matter? Why does the genetic relatedness play out here? Well, how does the genetic relatedness play out here? Well, as it turns out, well, the queen is 50% related to both of her sons and her daughters, the workers here. And as it turns out, because of the way that sexual reproduction is happening or not, I should say, because of the way that reproduction is happening, whether asexually or sexually, this leads to differences in the relatedness of her offspring. And so workers are going to be 75% related to one another by virtue of this mating system. Whereas the workers and the drones are only going to be 25% related to one another as a virtue of this particular mating system. And this has some interesting consequences, especially if we start looking at this from the perspective of the queen, the perspective of the drone, or the perspective of the worker. Now, these workers potentially have the chance to become reproductive. Most of them are sterile, but occasionally one of these workers will turn into a reproductive female, might end up becoming a new queen. Sometimes the queen or one of the workers will kill a worker who starts to become reproductive, because, as it turns out, if the queen's daughters reproduce, they're going to be a lot more distantly related to the queen than if her sons reproduce. And again, this all comes back to this concept of the coefficient of relatedness. As it turns out, if the queen's daughters do end up becoming reproductive, her grandchildren, her granddaughters, grandsons, will only be 25% related to the queen. Whereas if her son goes on to reproduce with another female, her offspring will be 50% related to her because she produced that son asexually. Now, I know this is a very complicated, sort of interesting genetic situation to try to interpret, but the idea is it's in the queen's best interest if her son reproduces. It's in the worker's best interest if her sisters reproduce. At the end of the day, if the queen's sons can't reproduce, then it's still somewhat in the queen's interest to have her daughters reproduce because they're still passing on some of her genetic information. And that's better than not having any of her offspring reproduce at all. So we see this sort of interesting situation that's driving the formation of these haplodiploid eusocial societies that we see in bees, wasps, and ants. And this explains a lot about why it is that these colonies of hymenopterans are behaving the way they do, why there is such extreme altruism in their societies. And a lot of it really just is based on their level of relatedness. In other words, it's really, really based on the amounts of inclusive fitness that different individuals within the society are gaining, so long as the society is going on, is able to pass on its genes to subsequent generations. Yet again, we're seeing this theme. Now, there's this other interesting form of altruism that we would call reciprocal altruism. And reciprocal altruism is really something that depends upon shared experiences amongst individuals. And so this is an idea where if a particular group of individuals helps another group of individuals, sort of regardless of their direct relatedness, then one group of individuals might be inclined to help the other in a future situation. And this has been demonstrated in these interesting experiments with pied flycatchers, which are these birds shown in this cartoon. And so in this experiment, sort of broken into these two phases. In the first phase of the experiment, some of these pied flycatchers are broken into three groups. And one of these groups is posed with a threat, which is a visual cue. And in this particular case, it's a stuffed owl. And these pied flycatchers are threatened by this stuffed owl. Well, it turns out this third group over here sees what's going on. And so individuals from the third group go over here to help defend this first group. This other group over here of pied flycatchers is caged. And so regardless of whether or not these pied flycatchers might be inclined to help group one, they can't do so because they're caged. And so this is sort of an interesting situation where there's some altruistic behavior from group three helping group one because they're threatened by this fake owl. In the second phase of this experiment, we see something interesting. The birds that were in this second group who were caged originally now are no longer caged, and they are posed with the similar threat of an owl. And also in this situation, the second group that had helped the first group in the first phase, now the second group is posed with the threat of the stuffed owl. And what we see happening is interesting. The first group goes to help the third group in this example. So the third group's being threatened by this stuffed owl, and presumably because that third group had helped the first group when they were threatened by the stuffed owl, now individuals from that first group will go to help individuals from the third group when they're threatened. And this again is altruistic behavior on the part of individuals from the first group, and we would call this reciprocal altruism because group one got help from group three in phase one. Now group three is getting help from group one in phase two. And individuals from group two, interestingly, because they didn't provide any help to the individuals from group one when they were threatened, or help to individuals from group one when they were threatened, they're not getting any help from either group one or three when they're threatened by this stuffed owl. And so this experiment demonstrates that there is learned behavior amongst individuals who have experienced altruism, and that altruism seems to be reciprocal between different groups of individuals who have helped each other in the past. And so this learned behavior really depends upon shared experiences amongst individuals. And when we talk about altruism and relatedness, sometimes we've often been talking about this at the level of kin. And so individuals who are siblings or cousins, parents and offspring, seem to have a higher chance of gaining indirect fitness from one another and a higher chance of exhibiting altruistic behavior. But in this example, we see where maybe individuals from groups 1, 2, and 3 aren't really each other's closest kin, but they're all in the same species. And they're all pied flycatchers. And so they all share some level of genetic information at some point. And so there's still something to be said about a vested interest in one group of pied flycatchers helping another, because at the end of the day, the pied flycatcher genome as a whole is persisting and getting passed on to subsequent generations. And that's better than the pied flycatchers all being preyed upon by owls and all going extinct. So we can talk about this being a sort of level at which altruistic behavior is selected on the species level. And this might even play up to things like genera, or even individuals who occur in similar communities having a vested interest in undergoing behaviors that benefit the greater good of whole communities. And this leads to something we might call group selection. And group selection is kind of a strange concept that can be applied in different ways. But basically, the idea is that there is selection amongst a larger coordinated network of different things. These could be species in an ecosystem. These could be different members of one species, or we could start thinking about this even happening on smaller levels, like the level of cells and tissues. One example we think of comes with viruses. And viruses obviously can be highly, highly infectious. And it could be in the selfish interest of a very, very highly infectious virion to become extremely virulent, because that allows it to increase the chances of it passing on its own genes. But if a particular virion is really, really virulent, it might not help persistence of the entire lineage, because these super virulent viruses are going to kill their hosts. And so that's kind of reducing the long-term persistence of the entire lineage. And so selection in this situation is kind of really favoring virions that are of an intermediate level of infectability. Virions that can replicate but don't kill their hosts are going to be selected over virions that are extremely virulent and do kill their hosts, generally speaking. And something similar plays out at the cellular level, where multicellularity really does require cooperation amongst a lot of different individual cells. And a lot of these different cells are, of course, assigned to all kinds of very specific functions, kind of like in a particular tissue, or maybe in a particular organ system. And all of these cells, basically within a certain individual, are just about genetically identical. And so they all share a vested interest in a given cell having a chance of the genes in that cell getting passed on to future generations. And this is kind of something favoring cooperation amongst these cells. So even if a cell could become selfishly renegade, for example, something like a cancer cell, it's not really in the greater interest of the entire organism for that to happen. It makes more sense for all the cells to coordinate their efforts so that this individual that they make up can reproduce and pass on the genes that basically all of those cells have to the next generation. Whereas if one cell, a cancer cell, becomes very, very selfish and tries to disproportionately use up resources and copy itself, that individual might have really extremely decreased fitness, because it's likely that it's not going to have as high of a chance of passing on its own genes if when compared to if those cells had been coordinated. And so in this way, really non-virulent viruses and cooperative cells are reciprocally altruistic. And their relatedness is kind of really driving kin selection for this kind of bizarre behavior. It's tough to recognize this as behavior, but it is behavior nonetheless. And it's behavior that represents cooperation that is being favored by natural selection for the very simple reason of increasing the chances that individuals are going to have genes passed on, so that viruses will have genes passed on, so that cells will have genes passed on, populations will have genes passed on. Passing on genes is the name of the game. So that's it for this lecture. I'll see you next time.